Hello, my name is Van Weigel, and in this presentation, I would like to offer some thoughts on the relationship between the Christian faith and business ethics. Now, I'd like to suggest, in terms of examining the relationship between faith and ethical conduct, that the key element here has to do with how faith impacts very important background features to ethical decision making and less about, okay, a person of faith is going to decide this or that way in terms of an ethical decision. One of these key attributes has to do with character. Now, this is not to say that people cannot have character unless they have religious faith. Hardly that's the case. There are people of wonderful character who are atheist or agnostic, but still, faith does provide an important point of contact in many people's lives for the development of character. And it is character that really drives moral decision making as well as moral leadership. A second quality where I think that we have a strong interface between faith and ethics has to do with courage. It is one thing to say, okay, I see this is what I need to do. It is another thing to do it. And that really requires personal resources of courage that can be helpful for people of religious faith. And again, this is not to say that people who are not religious can't be courageous. Obviously, they are, and they can be, but instead to suggest this is an important point of overlap or interface between faith and ethics. It is striking, for example, on studies have indicated that people who decide to engage in whistleblowing, knowing full well that they likely will not be successful, that they will be opening themselves up to all kinds of criticism and ostracism on the part of their work colleagues. These individuals often are motivated on religious grounds, believing that I don't care what the impact is to me in my career or my family. I do care, of course, but I care more about what God is going to think of me when the day is done if I don't do the right thing in this situation. Now, there's another quality that I think is really important for religious faith, and that has to do with the quality of hope. And it is striking to me that many people within the Christian community often seem quite pessimistic about the prospects for human progress, for example, or the notion that we can ourselves bring about meaningful change, working in partnership with God and other people. And all this really requires an attitude of hope, of anticipation for the future. What could happen because of the powerful way that Jesus is working even to this day among human communities and affecting change. And I am struck that there are incredibly positive movements afoot in the world today that I think are inspired by God and provide a basis for hope. But again, I think it's quite interesting that many people who identify themselves as Christians often seem pessimistic in their orientation for meaningful change, maybe because of the weight of human sinfulness. But truthfully, there are real grounds for feeling hope, and that is a really important building block of both ethical decision making and ethical leadership. And then finally, there is this very fascinating concept called the passion for life, articulated very well in 1978 by a German theologian named Jürgen Moltmann. And basically, the passion for life gets at a celebration of life and all that it brings with it. and gets at a desire to thrive and to live with gusto, which I think is very much a religious trait, or should be a religious trait, as opposed to thinking of life in dour, pessimistic terms and not celebrating the present because you're always thinking about the future. Passion for life and orientation for passion for life is basically to live in a full-bodied way with gusto. And when you think about it, often the people that you admire and are drawn to are individuals who have, in their own person, seem to have this quality of the passion for life. So these, I think, are very critical points of contact between faith and ethics. Now, if we were to think more specifically about the ethical content of decisions, I'd like to bring your attention to 4 possible approaches to developing a Christian business ethic. And all of these 4 approaches really relate to how can we use the Bible as a resource for understanding our ethical obligations. Now, the first is ethics by command, and that would be using a body of commands or rules like the 10 Commandments as a way of understanding one's ethical obligation. And it's quite interesting if you were to go out into the highways and byways and just ask people, so what do you base your morality on? Regardless of whether a person is of religious faith or not, they're going to probably say the 10 Commandments, because that seems like a familiar body of moral material or standards that people could live by. The second approach would be ethics by institution modeling. And the idea here is to replicate in contemporary context either modifications or adaptations of biblical institutions that are talked about in the Bible. Now, that necessarily brings us within the territory of the Hebrew Scriptures or the Old Testament as opposed to the New Testament, because most of the institutions of the Bible, the history of Israel, is in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures. And an example of this will be the year of Jubilee and the incredibly positive economic impact of the year of Jubilee on the economy of the Israeli nation. A third approach would be ethics by analogy, where one is trying to draw connections between biblical stories and contemporary life. And a great example of ethics by analogy would be WWJD, What Would Jesus Do? Thinking about Jesus confronting something similar in his life and ministry, and how would we reflect that in a decision in a contemporary context. And then finally, the fourth approach would deal with ethics by principle, by identifying within Scripture some key principle or principles that would be used to determine the rightness or wrongness of a particular action. And for me, the go-to principle would be the second great commandment, or of course the golden rule as well. Let's turn to ethics by command and look more closely at this particular approach. As mentioned previously, the focus of this approach is to look at specific commands or rules that are contained in Scripture, and then use those rules as guidelines for contemporary behavior in business. Now, again, the 10 Commandments would be one of the go-to resources that most people would refer to. And it's interesting that the rules, thou shalt not lie or thou shalt not steal, were used, as you know, quite extensively in the book Ethics for the Real World. So that is definitely very relevant. But the Scripture also has a very strong prohibition on charging interest. What are you going to do with that? People interpret this now as in a sort of friendly way to capitalism by thinking, well, that is not really a prohibition on charging of interest, but it's a prohibition on usury or usurious rates of interest. But that is an interpretation that we would bring to the scripture that is really not there within the scripture itself. So this is quite a controversial point, and it's noteworthy that within the Islamic world, there are some pretty creative things done with Islamic development banks trying to get around this prohibition of charging interest in ways that allow them to have, I think, more effective and responsible banking systems than we would in the West, particularly when it comes to the development of new businesses and offering of resources for new business startups. Also, one could argue that there is an inherent weakness in any rule because you can find exceptions to that rule. I've noted one already in terms of the discussion of the situation facing a Kantian decision maker who wants to abide by the categorical imperative and tell the truth, but at the door we have the SS soldier who basically wants to know if you're harboring Jews in the attic. There's a very interesting real life story that comes from Corrie ten Boom, who talks about a similar situation she experienced with her sister when a SS soldier entered their home and they were harboring Jews. They were giving them safe passage underneath their dining room table, under the floorboards in their dining room. And so when she was asked as a little girl with her sister, where are the Jews? She pointed underneath the table. Now the table had a tablecloth over it. And so when these two soldiers walked over and looked under the table, both she and her sister broke out in uproarious laughter, making fun of these guys, thinking that they were hiding under this tablecloth. And so they immediately were embarrassed and then left and went on to other houses. Well, technically, in the retelling of this, Corrie ten Boom notes, well, yes, they were under the table, so maybe she didn't really lie in this situation. But truth be told, everything about her demeanor and her sister's demeanor was to create a sense of deception. She wasn't sweating bullets when sort of they looked under the table. She just broke out in uproarious laughter like she was just having the time of her life. So any rule like thou shalt not lie, you would think could have exceptions. More remarkably is the case of stealing. And I know this sounds odd, but it is the truth, and that is that throughout most of Christian history, there was the attitude that one could steal if it was absolutely necessary to provide for your family. And the idea went like this. This goes back to the notion of natural law. Human law specifies private property rights. God's law would maintain that fathers or mothers have a right to support their families and children. And so in times of economic need, say a famine, say somebody is hoarding grain, for example, you would have an obligation to go to them and ask them politely, can I use some of your grain to feed my family? But if they refused and there was no other means possible, it would be permissible to steal that grain because God's law trumps out human law, and human law is going to determine, of course, the private property rights. So while I think one should say, yes, it's a very good idea not to steal, that really depends on a larger concept of private property. And the more extensive the notion of private property, the more in question the notion of private property and stealing should come into play. So that, I think, complicates the picture quite a bit for an ethics by command approach. Now, a second approach is ethics by institution modeling. And the idea here is to try to replicate in present day the institutions of the Bible, and which basically means the institutions of biblical history and the state of Israel as shown in the Hebrew scriptures or the Old Testament. This approach was widely used in medieval Europe, particularly in trying to revise the notion of the priesthood as it existed in ancient Israel. And one example that I would point to that is very constructive and almost absolutely remarkable in terms of its relevance for recent times is the year of Jubilee. The year of Jubilee specified that at every interval of 50 years, all of the original wealth that had been taken by others should be returned to the original owners so that people could get a fresh start and that they would not deal with a persistent situation of economic immiseration. And so this was a way to start everyone off on a more equal footing. When we had the turn of the new millennium in the year 2000, there were both Christian and secular individuals within the World Bank and also the International Monetary Fund who saw the turn of the millennium as an opportunity to bring about a refreshing change in the debt structure of many developing countries by allowing countries a measure of debt forgiveness along the lines of the year of Jubilee. In many cases, the loans that were taken out, often by dictators without any consent of their people, were repaid many times over, but they were still on the hook for those loans because they had just been paying the interest on the loans and not paying the principal down. So it would make sense for people at the World Bank and the IMF, International Monetary Fund, to encourage countries to get out of that debt and then to make the sorts of investments that would create a platform for growth in the future. This was highly successful in terms of actually making the case for debt forgiveness. The sad thing about it is that those people who organized this and pressed for it were not as careful on the implementation side to make sure that the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund would actually come through with the goods and pursue debt forgiveness in the full-bodied way that had been envisioned by the year of Jubilee in these institutions. A third approach, which I personally am drawn to, is ethics by analogy. The focus of this approach is to try to establish a connection between biblical narratives and our contemporary situation. We would do that by looking at a biblical character, or say Jesus, for example, and noting that, okay, he faced an issue that was somewhat similar to the dilemma that we face, and so let's learn about what did he do and how could we think of doing something similar in our current context. Now, the problem with any analogy is that often analogies break down because situations are sometimes more dissimilar than similar. But I think this is a very productive way to think about biblical ethics and ethical responsibility, because there are so many wonderful stories that we know of in Scripture about the life of Jesus and how he conducted himself. So people who advocate WWJD, what would Jesus do, are using this approach of ethics by analogy to try to understand their Christian obligations in present day. And I frankly am all for it. I think this seems like a really, really good, productive way to go. Finally, one could think about business ethics from the standpoint of ethics by principle, looking at Scripture and deriving from Scripture principles, not rules, but principles that can be used to apply to current issues in ethical decision making. So the focus of this approach is what principle or principles are we going to find within Scripture that we're going to hold up as a guide for our own ethical thinking in this regard. And of course, the two prominent candidates would be the Golden Rule and Jesus' second great commandment. And despite the problem of application, for example, with the Golden Rule, or the problem of the neighbor in Jesus' second great commandment, these are fabulously wonderful, productive principles that can be applied to virtually any context in business today. Now, there is, I think, a question that, to my mind, is very unresolved, and that is, does a Christian business ethic apply to both Christians and non-Christians alike? This is not an easy question to unpack. If a Christian ethic applies only, to both Christians and non-Christians, one could ask, what then makes it distinctively Christian? On the other hand, if a Christian ethic applies only to Christians, then does this simply specify how Christian employees or business owners should conduct themselves in the workplace, not a business ethics per se, because business ethics is dealing with the broader context of how people of all faiths relate to one another. So if it is the latter approach, that is, this is what Christians should do in business, the concern would be that a Christian business ethic would be like more of a small conversation, an internal conversation about special obligations that people have because of faith, as opposed to something that is transformational that could apply to people of all faith traditions. My bias is to go to the notion of a business ethic that is broad enough that it is deeply relevant for both Christians and non-Christians alike. And this would put me more in the camp of thinking about a principle-based approach like the Golden Rule or Jesus' second great commandment. But truthfully, this is a very difficult thing to unpack, and you could draw a completely different conclusion to this and be well within your rights in doing so. Well, that concludes this discussion of the Christian faith and business ethics. Thank you so much for joining me.